All right, part two of our lecture on partial payments. This will be the last lecture on partial payments. So we saw last time this idea of the United States rule and how if you're borrowing money on a loan that you're going to have to pay back in one full lump sum at the end of your loan term. So if you have to pay everything back in one lump sum at the end, um, you can instead maybe if you want to, you could make a partial payment. And we talked about how that partial payment first gets rid of your interest. It first pays off the interest, and then it starts to lower your principal. Um, and we looked at mathematically how that sort of affects how much you actually owe on the final date, as well as how much interest it saves you by making a partial payment. So just a quick recap of that. And I promised last lecture that I would include sort of a more formulaic approach to doing this. And while we will see this formulaic approach, we'll still see that it follows this sort of step-by-step method that we did here. So very first things to note, P1 is going to be that starting loan amount. So that's how much you're borrowing in the beginning. And then T1 is the time from the start of the loan to first partial payment. So it's the amount of time that passes from when you first take out the loan until you make your first partial payment. Kind of got that squeezed all in there right there. And so the very first thing that we can do is we can say, well, hey, okay, this loan started off on day one. And then after a certain amount of time, presumably in days, but it doesn't have to be days. It could be months, could be years. But after a certain amount of time, we make a partial payment. This is our first partial payment. And that time is indicated by T1. We can calculate that interest that accrues during that time period. I'm going to call that interest I1. So we use our simple interest formula. Again, this formula could be compound interest. We won't see problems like that, but it's good to know that it doesn't have to just be simple interest. You could use any number of interest calculations. You could do simple interest, you could do compound interest, you could do other types of interest that we aren't even going to talk about. But for us, we're just going to deal with the simple interest formula. So we've got P1, which is that loan amount multiplied by the interest rate R. Go ahead and write that in. R is the interest rate. That won't change at all. And then as we saw before, this T1 here, that has to be in years. So P1 times R times T1 written in years, in units of years. Once we have that interest that accrues over that first chunk of time, then we can just add that to the original borrowed amount, which is that P1 plus the interest that accrues during that first time period. And that gives us the amount that is owed on that day that I make that first partial payment. And obviously, we're not done. It's a partial payment. So I haven't paid off everything, but I paid off some of it. And now this is how much I owe. So now that I owe this amount A1, if I subtract off what I'm calling Y1, which is our partial payment amount, let's go ahead and I'll point to that right there. Partial payment amount, abbreviate that AMT. So that Y1 is our partial payment amount. So if I take the amount that I owe on the day I make my partial payment and I subtract off the amount that I pay, that gives me a new principal. That new principal just says, hey, this is now how much you owe after you've made your partial payment. And then time is going to continue on. And so then what we have to do is for the next chunk of time from that current date until my next partial payment, I have to calculate the interest. And that interest is how much I owed at the beginning of this chunk of time multiplied by the interest rate, multiplied by however much time elapsed during that or during that second chunk of time, which would be in between my first partial payment and my second partial payment. This time again has to be in years. And this, I put a ... down here because you can see this sort of repetition where I have these three things, and then it's just interest calculation, future value calculation, principal calculation. And then it just keeps going on forever and ever and ever. It just repeats itself until we hit the date of maturity, until you haven't made any more partial payments and you're just ready to pay the final amount on the date of maturity. So we see this repetition. We've got our nice formulas here. We'll use Y1 for that partial payment amount. So now that we've sort of recapped all this, let's go ahead and look at another example and work it out. So on March 3rd, I take out a $6,000 loan with simple interest of 10% and a date of maturity of June 28th. So I take it out on March 3rd. I got to pay it all back on June 28th. On April 7th, I'm going to make a partial payment of $1,000, and I want to know how much I owe on the date of maturity, that June 28th. And we can go through and we can just do this whole outline here. We can first calculate the interest and then move on. And let's actually start off by doing that. Let's actually calculate that interest. I1 is equal to P1 R T1, and P1 is that $6,000 multiplied by the interest rate of 10%, which as a decimal would be 0.1. And then here is where we run into some issues. This T1. You can see in the problem that I told you that I took out this loan on March 3rd, and I make a partial payment on April 7th, to make my first partial payment on April 7th. So the time period is from March 3rd to April 7th. And the issue with that is that I don't know exactly how many days that is. I mean, obviously I could just count up March 3rd, March 4th, March 5th, and just continue on. But just off the top of my head, I don't know how many days that is. And so I don't have that time frame. And so this is exactly where I'm going to sort of pause. I'm going to say, okay, well, we've got this example, but the problem is we're using actual dates. In our last lecture, we just looked at numbers. I just said, hey, the date of maturity is 130 days later. It's 200 days later. It's 10 days later. But here I'm actually giving us calendar dates. And so we have to have a way to actually calculate how many days are passing by when I go between two calendar dates. And luckily, we have a cheat sheet for that. So we will actually take a look at this day numbering cheat sheet. And I know this is probably zoomed out quite a bit. It might be kind of hard to read this, but that's okay. So what we've got here is we have basically a counting of which calendar day corresponds to what day of the year it is. So obviously, January 1st is the first day of the year. December 31st is the 365th day of the year. But then you could just sort of keep counting down the days until you say, I don't know, June 8th, let's say. So if I look at June and I look at 8 and I come over and I come down, that's going to take me right here onto day 159. And so June 8th is the 159th day of the year. And so what this sheet right here, what this cheat sheet allows us to do is it allows us to calculate the number of days in between two dates. And let's start off with a very simple example. Let's say that we were looking at January 5th to January 9th. Now, obviously, you're probably looking at that and you're just like, well, that's 4 days, January 5th to January 9th. Great. And so what we would do here is we would look at January 5th corresponding to day number 5. We would look at January 9th corresponding to day number 9, and we would subtract those two values, 9 minus 5 giving me 4. You could continue on. You could do this. Let's just change this right here to February 9th. And now that might be a little bit harder. We're kind of overlapping months here, right? We would presume that this is like a month and 4 days, but then we start to ask the question, well, how many days are in January? And you might know off the top of your head that there's 31, but maybe you don't know that for every single month. Well, we have our sheet here, so we can use January 5th corresponds to that day. February 9th corresponds to that day. That's 40 minus 5, which is 35 days. And so that right there, the subtraction is a great way of telling us, hey, this is how we can sort of calculate the number of days in between the two calendar dates that I give you. Now, there's a couple issues with this cheat sheet here that we kind of have to work around. And the first one is actually leap years and the extra day that is included, and that's February 29th. So what we want to be careful of is this calendar, what I'll make a note of, it does not include a day for February 29th. You can see that 29th of February right there, it is not, there's nothing written there. So if we are in a leap year, which 2020 is a leap year, 2024 is a leap year, 2028 is a leap year. There's actually a whole bunch of rules for leap years. But basically it's just every 4 years, or at least for what we have to worry about here. And so on those years, we have to make sure that we sort of count an extra day. And so if we were to be looking at the number of days between, say, let's edit this example yet again, between January 5th and let's say March 9th. Well, we would take a look at January 5th. I have it boxed right there. And then March 9th is right here. We would do 68 minus 5, and that's 63 days. But if we are in a leap year, then we actually need to add 1 to that to get 64 days. And you'd have to know if we were talking about a leap year. I mean, you'd have to know that we were in a year of 2020, 2024, 2028, and so on. So leap years you got to watch out for. You may have to add another day. The other issue with this is if I span multiple years. So maybe I tell you that I go from January 5th of 2020 to March 9th of 2021, and you have to span a whole year there. And so obviously doing your subtraction here, that's going to give you your 63 days, but we're actually looking at a whole year as well as these 63 days. So if you span multiple years, what you actually have to do is you have to add that year into your calculation, which means adding 365 to your number. If it is a leap year that you're spanning over, you have to add that extra day as well. So 366. If you could have a loan spanning 4 or 5 years and you got to add a lot of days to it, but that's okay. So there's the leap year, there's the spanning multiple years. The last scenario is if we cross over into a new year. And so a great example of this, let me get rid of a lot of this stuff right here that we've already seen. What if we go from, say, December 29th to January 3rd? Let's go ahead and write that out. December 29th. And let's say 2021, just to give ourselves years, to January 3rd, 2022. So we've got that right there. We might want to ask ourselves, is this a leap year that we're crossing over? And what I'd point out is that it actually doesn't even matter because we don't even cross over the possible February 29th. So I don't care about a leap year. That's okay. And so the instinctive thing to do would be to take the 363 and subtract 3 and just get 360. But obviously, December 29th of 2021 to January 3rd of 2022 isn't 360 days. It's more like 5 actually. And you could even count that. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right there. So you could actually see that that's 5 days looking at this sheet. Well, how do I actually get that? Because I'm getting 360 here. Well, what we have to do if we cross over that year is we have to take this number and we have to do 365 minus that number that we get. It's sort of counting the other way, if you will. So rather than me starting on December 29th and sort of counting all of this in days in between, all of these 360 days in between, I'm really just counting these 5 right there. And so I do that 365 minus the number that I get, that gives me my 5. You can see I wrote that little formula right there. So there is a good sort of list of common mistakes, the things to look out for, the leap years spanning multiple years or crossing over to a new year. So be careful of those things. Let's go back to this example. Let's actually work it out just to get practice with more of these partial payment questions. You'll notice here that there's really not much of a difference in how we do these problems when I give you calendar dates as opposed to just, hey, it's 130 days or something like that. It's really just, we just have this added step of using our cheat sheet to calculate the number of days in between. So let's go ahead and start things off. I am going to label some of our important variables. We've got P1 is 6,000. We've got R is equal to 10%, which is equal to 0.1. And then we have a time, T1, which is the time from the first day, March 3rd, until our partial payment, which occurs on April 7th. So I'll kind of put that in quotes because obviously this isn't a mathematical thing, but it's just that amount of time that occurs. And if we go back, let's take a look. I'm going to copy this page over, give us something fresh here. So we are looking at April 7th as our day of our partial payment. And so let's find April. Let's find 7. Let's go down. Let's go across. I see this nice 97 right there. And so the April 7th will be the 97th day of the year. And so we'll put in a 97. We're going to subtract off the whatever day we get for March 3rd. Let's go back right here. So we're going to go to March 3rd. We're going to get this 62 right there. So then we have 62. And this is going to be 35 days. Ooh, and let me be clear here. This actually isn't T1. Because remember, T1 needs to be in terms of years. So let's go ahead. Let me give myself some space. Put these things in their appropriate spot. So we've got that. Now, this tells me that T1 in terms of years is going to be 35 divided by 365. And so that's our T1 right there. What I do want to mention is that you can always very easily check this, right? Sort of thinking just if you had a calendar, sort of in your head and you're thinking about this, March 3rd to April 7th, that's a little bit more than a month. And obviously 35 days is a little bit more than a month. A month is typically 30, 31 days. And so this is a little bit more than a month. If you got an answer like 720 or, if you got a negative number, something just crazy that didn't make sense, you should be able to catch yourself there and recognize the error. So we've got 35 days for the first partial payment right there. And so that's going to be our T1. Let's go ahead and box some of these because I am actually going to have some more important things I want to point out. And so the other two things that I want to point out here are the amount of our partial payment. So let's go ahead, put that up there. Sneak that right in there. I want to sneak in our partial payment is $1,000. I said before, I'm going to call that Y1. So we'll have that right there. So we've got that. And then really the last thing that I want to calculate is our second time period, which is from the date that I make my partial payment until I have to pay the loan off, which is April 7th to June 28th. And so we'll do the same exact thing. I'm going to do this in red just to make it stand out a little bit better. April 7th to June 28th. And so we should find out what June 28th is. Well, June 28th looks to me, let's go all the way down, let's go all the way across, let's see where those intersect. Looks to me like right at 179. Got that right there. Circle that, 179, yay. And so we'll put that in, 179. And now we actually already did April 7th. It was 97. We found that right here before, April 7th, 97. So 179 minus 97, that's going to give me 82 days. And then we're going to call this T2 is going to be the number of days, but converted to years. It's going to be that time frame converted to years right there. So we got that right there. Let me do some coloring just to make things look a little bit neater, separated. Color, let's make that orange. And there we go. So we've got all of the relevant information here. That is all fine and dandy. Let's go ahead and copy all of this over nice and succinctly onto another slide. And we'll kind of stick all this up there in the corner. Give me a second to just change a color, make it look a little nicer. There we go. All right. So we got our P1. We've got our R. We've got our T1 here. We've got a Y1. And we've got a T2. We'll go ahead and erase this. We already did those calculations. All right. So we have all of the relevant information. We've got our times. We've got our starting principal. We've got our interest rate. Let's go ahead. I do actually want to make this a different color as well, just to point out that it's going to be used a little bit later. Great. So we're going to start off with the blue and the orange here, and we're going to calculate the interest that accrues in this first chunk of time. So we start off on March 3rd. We're going to go until April 7th. And we're going to finish at June 28th. And we know that this first time frame is going to be 35 days. We know that this time frame is going to be 82 days. And so we can calculate the interest that is accrued in each of these sections. So let's start off with I1 is equal to P1 times R times T1. And that P1 is going to be 6,000 multiplied by our interest rate of 0.1, and then multiplied by the time T1, which is the 35 days, but written in years, so 35 over 365. When we do this, we end up getting $57.53. So that is the interest that is accrued during that time period. So let's go ahead and write 57.53 equals interest accrued. And so now on April 7th, I am going to owe, I'm going to give myself a little bit more space here. I'm going to owe the original 6,000 that I borrowed, but I'm also going to have to pay back this interest. Separate that out. Separate that out. There we go. So I am going to actually owe here. let's go ahead and do this in this blue here. I'm going to owe the $6,000, but also the $57.53. And I just did that work in my head, but we could see here that I'm really just taking A1 is how much I owe on April 7th is just P1 plus I1, which is my 6,000 plus my 57.53, which is 6,057.53. That's how much I owe on April 7th. And then I make a $1,000 payment. So what I can do is I can say that the new amount that I owe, P2, it's a new principal. It's going to be how much I owed on April 7th. And I'm going to subtract off my partial payment, which remember we called Y1. And so this is going to be that 6,057.53 minus 1,000 is equal to 5,057.53. And that right there is how much I owe on April 7th. And there we go. Now I can just do it all over again. We have effectively forgotten. We've dealt with the first 35 days. We can forget about it. Now I have a loan of $5,057.53 from the 82 days between April 7th and June 28th. And so if we go ahead and we calculate the interest on it, we can write that right in here. We can say equals interest accrued. I have yet to calculate this. I'm about to, though. Interest accrued. Make that a little bit, move that over there a little bit. Interest accrued. This is going to take us onto another slide. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll kind of skip back and forth. So our interest accrued, I'm going to call it I2 because it's over the second period of time. It's the amount P2 that I owed right there. We've calculated it right here. P2 is that 5,057 and 53 cents. And it's that multiplied by my interest rate, multiplied by the time of that second section, that 82 days that we saw back here, that 82 right there. But obviously we want to put that in years. We've done that right up here in the red in T2. So we've got this. We can actually write all this out. So we've got 5,057 and 53 cents multiplied by 0.1, our interest rate, multiplied by the time, 82 days over 365. That's putting it into years. Space things out a little bit better. And when we do this, we end up with a little bit more interest, $113.62. So there we go. That is the interest that it accrues during this time frame, 113.62. There we go. That's the interest that accrues. So what we do now is on June 28th, to find out how much we owe, we just have to take how much I owed on April 7th, and I have to add that interest in. So I'm just adding these two numbers, and that is going to give me my final answer to the question that we're looking for. It's going to be that final amount to A2 is going to be the amount that I originally owed plus the interest. That amount that I originally owed, we have it right above us, 5,057.53 plus the interest that we just calculated. And that is going to give us to a nice $5,171.16. You might look right here at the 3 and the 2 in the second decimal place there and realize, hey, how is that a 6? Well, what I've done here in my calculations is I've actually kept all of my decimals. I've only written the first, the first 2, but I've kept all of my decimals. And so we end up having this little rounding deal. Again, as I mentioned before, don't worry too much if you get 0.15 or 0.14. If you're within a couple cents, that's fine. I'm not going to worry too much about that. But this is our final amount right here we'll go ahead and box that because that's our nice important answer right there. And let's go ahead and actually write this onto our timeline that we had before. So 5171.16. And that's how much is owed on the date of maturity on June 28th, on that last day. You'd have to make a payment of that amount in order to finish off the loan. So that right there is yet another example. And really the only difference between this example and examples we may have done last time is just these dates that I give you. And it's really just right here. That right there is the only tricky part or the only new part that we have to worry about, just calculating the number of days in between the two dates, the two calendar dates. Everything else, all of this on this slide and this slide is all the same thing that we've done before. No different there. Once we calculate the 35 and the 82 days, we're just on our normal problem solving of partial payments. So I'll go ahead and leave that as the lecture, and I'll see you next time.